It's strange how a person can spend 40 years building a life and still end up eating dinner alone in silence. Every morning, he sat beside the same window with the same cup of cold coffee, watching strangers walk past his house like he no longer existed. No phone calls, no visitors, no reason to leave the house anymore. But one rainy afternoon, a single letter arrived in his mailbox. And before the sun went down that day, everything changed. His name was Walter Bennett. He was 72 years old, retired and forgotten. At least, that's what he believed. Walter used to wake up every morning at 5:30 sharp. Even after retirement, his body still remembered the old factory schedule. For 43 years, he worked at a steel manufacturing plant outside Pittsburgh. He never missed a shift, never complained, never asked life for more than what he earned with his own hands. He was the kind of man who fixed broken chairs instead of throwing them away. The kind of father who skipped buying new shoes so his son could play baseball. The kind of husband who held his wife's hand every Sunday morning while walking to church. But life has a quiet way of changing people slowly. His wife, Margaret, passed away 8 years earlier after battling cancer. Walter still remembered the last thing she whispered to him in the hospital room. "Don't let loneliness turn your heart cold." Back then, he promised her it never would. But promises are easier to make when someone is still beside you. After Margaret died, the house became painfully quiet. The ticking clock in the hallway sounded louder every night. Walter tried keeping himself busy at first. He watered the plants, repaired old furniture in the garage, read newspapers from beginning to end. But slowly, the days became heavier. His son Daniel moved to Chicago for work years ago. Calls became shorter over time. "Sorry, Dad. Busy week. Maybe next month. You know how work is." Walter always answered the same way. "Of course, son. I understand." And he truly did understand. That was the problem. He understood everyone except himself. One cold November evening, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, eating canned soup straight from the pot. The television played quietly in the background, but he wasn't watching it. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty chair across from him. Margaret's chair. Sometimes he still imagined she was there, smiling softly, telling him not to overcook the soup, asking him about his day even when nothing interesting happened. The loneliness wasn't loud anymore. It was worse than that. It became normal. And when loneliness becomes normal, people stop trying to escape it. The next morning, Walter walked to the grocery store wearing the same brown coat he'd owned for 15 years. The cashier smiled politely. "How are you today, Mr. Bennett?" Walter forced a small smile. Oh, still breathing. The cashier laughed awkwardly, but Walter wasn't joking. On his walk home, he noticed something strange. Nobody really looked at him anymore. Cars passed by. People hurried along sidewalks. Young couples laughed while staring at their phones. To the world, he had become invisible. An old man carrying grocery bags. Nothing more. That night, he opened an old photo album from the closet. Dust covered the edges. Inside were pictures of birthdays, camping trips, Christmas mornings, and school graduations. There was one photo he stared at longer than the others. Daniel, at 12 years old. Big smile. Baseball uniform. Too large for his skinny body. Walter remembered working double shifts for months just to pay for that baseball camp. And he would have done it 1,000 times again. He touched the photograph gently, then whispered into the empty room. "I hope you're happy, son." But the room answered with silence. Days passed the same way they always did. Wake up, coffee, silence, sleep, until the rain came. It was a dark afternoon in December. Heavy rain tapped against the windows while Walter sat in his old armchair half asleep. The sound of the mailbox outside snapped him awake. He almost ignored it. Bills usually came on Thursdays, but something in him pushed his tired body toward the front door. Walter opened the mailbox slowly. Inside was a single white envelope, no return address. His name was written carefully by hand. Not printed, not rushed, carefully. For some reason, his heart began beating faster. He stepped back inside and closed the door behind him. Rainwater dripped from his coat sleeves onto the floor as he stared at the envelope in his trembling hands. He couldn't explain why. But suddenly the house didn't feel so empty anymore. Walter sat at the kitchen table before opening it. His fingers hesitated. Then finally, he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was uneven, almost nervous. It said, "Dear Mr. Bennett, you probably do not remember me. My name is Marcus Reed. 20 years ago, you helped a scared young man outside the steel factory on the worst night of his life. You told me something I never forgot. You said, 'A man is not finished just because life knocks him down. I need to see you again. Please.'" Walter froze. The words hit him like a wave from another lifetime. Marcus Reed. The name sounded familiar, distant, like an old song buried deep in memory. Walter leaned back slowly, trying to remember. And then it came back all at once. 20 years earlier. Vinta. Midnight shift. A young man sitting outside the factory gates with blood on his face and tears in his eyes. Walter remembered walking over to him. "You all right, kid?" The young man shook his head. "My life's over." Walter sat beside him on the cold sidewalk that night for almost 2 hours. The young man had lost his mother, his apartment, and his job in the same week. He said he had nothing left. Walter remembered telling him something simple. Life breaks everybody at some point, but broken things still have value. At the time, Walter didn't think much of it. Just words from an older man trying to comfort someone younger. But now, 20 years later, someone remembered. Walter read the letter again and again, his eyes slowly filled with tears. Not because of sadness, but because for the first time in years, he felt seen. He wasn't invisible to everyone after all. Someone remembered his kindness. Someone remembered his words. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. He sat awake beside the lamp, rereading the letter while rain continued falling outside. And deep inside his tired heart, something small began waking up again. Hope. The next morning, Walter shaved carefully for the first time in weeks. He combed his gray hair, polished his old shoes, even cleaned the living room a little. It felt strange, like preparing for a life he thought had already ended. At exactly 2 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Walter's chest tightened. He opened it slowly. Standing there was a tall man in his 40s, wearing a dark coat soaked from snow. His eyes looked tired, but warm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man smiled. "You probably still don't remember me." Walter stared carefully, and suddenly, he saw it. The same frightened young eyes from 20 years ago, only older now, stronger. Walter whispered softly, "Marcus?" Marcus nodded. Then something unexpected happened. The grown man standing on that porch suddenly began crying. Real tears. The kind people spend years hiding. "You saved my life," Marcus said. Walter stood frozen, because nobody had ever told him that before. Not his boss, not his son, not even himself. Marcus wiped his eyes and laughed nervously. "I know this sounds crazy, but I've spent 20 years trying to find you." Walter invited him inside. The old house felt different that afternoon. Warmer somehow, like life itself had walked back through the front door. Marcus sat at the kitchen table looking around slowly. "This place looks exactly how I remembered it." Walter poured coffee, quietly. "You remembered my house too?" Marcus smiled softly. "I remembered everything." Outside, snow began falling gently. Inside, 2 men from different generations sat across from each other, connected by one forgotten conversation from decades earlier. And for the first time in many years, Walter Bennett no longer felt alone. Walter and Marcus talked for hours that evening. The coffee turned cold several times, but neither of them noticed. For the first time in years, Walter wasn't counting the minutes of the day. He wasn't staring at the clock waiting for nighttime to arrive. He was simply listening. And somehow, being listened to as well. Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked around the small kitchen. "You still have the same old clock," he said with a smile. Walter chuckled softly, "And it still runs 5 minutes slow." For a moment, the house almost sounded alive again. Not because of noise, but because of connection. Marcus slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn and folded from years of being carried around. He handed it to Walter carefully. Walter adjusted his glasses and stared at the picture. It was Marcus, young, thin, standing beside a small moving truck. And beside him was a woman holding a little girl. "My wife and daughter," Marcus said quietly. Walter looked up in surprise. "You have a family." Marcus nodded. "Because of you." Walter frowned gently. "No, son. You built that life yourself." Marcus shook his head immediately. "You don't understand." His voice cracked slightly. "That night outside the factory, I was planning to end my life." The room became silent. Walter slowly lowered the photograph. Marcus stared at the table while speaking. "My mother had just died. I lost my apartment. I had no money left, no job. Nobody cared whether I disappeared or not." His eyes filled with tears again. "I remember sitting there thinking the world would be better without me." Walter's breathing became heavier. Marcus continued softly. "Then you sat beside me." Walter remembered the freezing sidewalk, the snow, the exhausted young man trying not to cry. "I thought you were just being polite," Marcus whispered. "But you stayed for 2 hours. You listened to me when nobody else would." Walter said nothing because suddenly he realized something painful. He couldn't even remember most of that night clearly. To him, it had been one small act of kindness in a lifetime filled with ordinary days. But to Marcus, it became the reason he stayed alive. "You told me broken things still have value," Marcus said. "I repeated those words to myself for years." Tears slowly rolled down Walter's face. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones. The kind older men hide from the world. Marcus smiled softly through his own tears. "I went back to school, got a new job, met my wife 2 years later, started my own business eventually." Walter looked stunned. Marcus laughed gently. "And every time life knocked me down, I remembered the old man outside the steel factory who treated a stranger like he mattered." Walter covered his eyes with one trembling hand, because after years of believing his life no longer mattered, he was finally hearing proof that it did. And maybe always had. The snow outside continued falling softly while silence filled the kitchen again. But this silence felt different, not empty, peaceful. Marcus reached into his pocket once more and placed another envelope on the table. Walter looked confused. "What's this?" Marcus smiled nervously. "En invitation." Walter opened it carefully. Inside was a printed card. "Grand opening ceremony. Reed Community Center." Walter looked up slowly. Marcus spoke with emotion in his voice. "We built a community center for struggling families and lonely seniors." Walter blinked in surprise. Marcus continued. "There's a small library inside, too." Walter smiled faintly. "That sounds wonderful." Marcus nodded. "But that's not the important part." Walter looked at him. Marcus swallowed hard before speaking. "We named the building after you." Walter froze completely. His eyes moved back to the card. Bennett House Community Center. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe properly. "No," Walter whispered. "You shouldn't have done that." Marcus leaned forward. "Yes, I should have." Walter shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. "I'm nobody special." Marcus smiled through tears. "That's exactly why you are." The old man looked away, unable to hide his emotions anymore. All his life, Walter believed greatness belonged to famous people, successful people, rich people. But sitting there in that tiny kitchen, he finally understood something most people never realize. A single moment of kindness can echo across decades. A few caring words can save a human life. And ordinary people often leave the deepest marks on the world. Marcus stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway. "There's someone else I want you to meet." Walter heard the front door open. A few seconds later, a little girl stepped inside holding Marcus's hand. She looked around curiously before smiling shyly. "This is my daughter, Emma," Marcus said softly. The little girl walked toward Walter. "Daddy says you're his hero." Walter's face broke completely. He knelt slowly despite the pain in his old knees. And for the first time in years, he laughed and cried at the same time. Emma wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, and in that moment, something inside Walter healed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind him life was not over. Enough to remind him the heart can still feel warmth after years of coldness. Marcus looked around the old house and smiled. You know, this place doesn't feel lonely anymore. Walter looked at the little girl beside him, then toward the kitchen, where laughter had finally returned. And softly, almost like a whisper to Margaret somewhere beyond the silence, he said, "You were right." That evening, after Marcus and Emma left, Walter stood alone by the window again. The same window, the same street, but everything felt different now. People still walked past. Cars still moved through the snow. The world had not changed. He had. For years, Walter believed he was forgotten because nobody called him. Nobody visited him. Nobody needed him anymore. But he finally understood something powerful. The value of a life cannot be measured by how many people remember your name. It is measured by how deeply you touch the hearts of others, even quietly, even briefly, even without realizing it. A few weeks later, Walter attended the opening ceremony of Bennett House Community Center. Families filled the building. Children laughed in the hallways. Elderly people played chess together near the windows. And above the entrance doors, written in large silver letters, were words Walter never imagined seeing in his lifetime. In honor of Walter Bennett, who reminded us that kindness can save a life. Walter stood there speechless, his eyes filled with tears again. Not tears of sadness, tears of meaning. Because after years of believing his story was over, life had given him one final chapter, and this one mattered more than all the others. So if you are listening to this today feeling forgotten, feeling invisible, feeling like your life no longer matters, remember this. You may never fully know how deeply your kindness affects another person. A smile, a conversation, a moment of patience, a few hopeful words. Sometimes those small things become the reason someone keeps going. Never underestimate the power of simply making another human being feel seen. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to Journey of Tales for more emotional stories about life, hope, love, and the moments that quietly change us forever.